Hey folks, it's Tom, your frugal prepper. I want to do a little video here about botulism. I hear a lot of misconceptions and people talk about botulism, and people think that they don't want to can because they don't want to give botulism to their family. And what botulism is, what it isn't, some of the myths that you hear about botulism, some things that people um, uh, say about botulism that are not true, and just what exactly it is. I think it's worth a somewhat in-depth look at botulism because botulism does not just relate to canning, it relates to all food storage. And it's important to know how it can get it and how you won't get it. Um, so I'll just dive in. Okay, first it's important to understand that the botulism is not the bacteria itself. Botulism is the poisoning that's caused by the toxin that's generated from the bacterium Clostridium botulinum. Okay, that's the actual name of the bacteria is Clostridium botulinum. But a lot of people will just say botulism, and they're referring to the bacteria and the disease. But it's important to know the difference. Eating botulism bacteria won't necessarily kill you. Eating the toxin that's generated from them will kill you. And this is important because we have to understand that botulism is everywhere. It's on every surface that you touch. You breathe it, you touch it, you eat it. It's on your food. You eat it all the time, and it doesn't normally hurt you. Okay? Botulism bacteria really comes from the dirt. We live on a planet called Earth, and it's made up of dirt, and it is in the air. That dust that you wipe off of your furniture when you dust is full of dirt, and it's full of millions and millions of botulism bacteria. And they're everywhere. Okay, so why don't we normally get sick from them? Well, normally botulism, and you'll hear them referred to as spores, even though some people would think a spore is something that comes from a type of fungus or mold so that it can reproduce, and that's true. But when we're talking about spores for botulism, we're talking about a bacteria that forms something called a endospore. And the endospore is a protective layer that grows around the bacteria that protects it, and inside it lays in a dormant state. Okay, it's asleep and it's not consuming and it's not excreting energy, and it can live in this dormant state for thousands of years. And while it's in this dormant state with this endospore around it, it is actually completely harmless to you. In fact, the bacteria itself is harmless to you, even if it's in its vegetative state. It's the toxin that it excretes. So it eats and then it poops out toxin, and that toxin is what makes you sick. And it will take 3 to 4 days of growth typically for the bacteria to make toxin. So, um, it's not always the bacteria that will, or I'm not saying it's the bacteria itself doesn't kill you. But normally it's in its dormant state anyway, and it will be on everything that you eat, and it's completely harmless. So what does it take? Let me back up a little bit. Botulism toxin is probably the most potent neurotoxin. Well, it is, I believe, classified by the Centers for Disease Control as the most potent neurotoxin, but it's probably also one of the most potent poisons in general just known to man. If you filled up this pint jar full of botulism, it would be enough to wipe out every living thing on the planet. Okay, that's 1 gram of botulism toxin is enough to kill a dozen people. Okay, it takes very minute amounts of it to make you sick. So what it requires in order for it to come out of that endospore and become active, or what they call a vegetative state, a state of growth, is 3 things. It requires a moist environment that's low in acid. It requires a temperature between 40 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And it requires an anaerobic environment. That's a low oxygen environment with less than 2% oxygen. So a lot of people think like, oh, this lid pinged down, it's sealed, I can feel that it's concave, it's sealed, it's good. Not necessarily. All that lid being concave does is tell you that that's a vacuum now. It's an anaerobic environment that is perfect for the growth of botulism from an oxygen standpoint. Okay, so when you're canning, you are, in order to prevent the growth of a lot of other microorganisms that won't grow in an oxygen depleted environment, you're making the perfect environment for botulism. And we also know that this is moist, right? And we know that this is low acid, and we're storing it at a temperature between 40 and 120. But we'll go into more of that here in a little bit. So really, there's two ways that you stay safe in food storage. You can cause the bacteria to remain dormant, or you can kill them. Now, I want to talk a little bit like when you preserve dry goods. You may put them in a jar, vacuum seal you some barley, right? And be like, hey, the oxygen's gone, but guess what? There's not a high moisture content. So the temperature's right, it's anaerobic, but with no moisture, it's perfectly safe because bacteria won't come out of its endospore unless there's a nice amount of moisture around. So, this is important to understand, that when you're vacuum sealing things in Mylar bags, making kits, that you keep things that may have liquid in them. Like if you're going to build you a kit and seal it in a Mylar bag, don't put the bottled water in there with some dry goods, because if there is any leakage, then you can create a moist environment and botulism could grow in there. So there's really two ways to stay safe in food storage, and one is we cause the bacteria to remain dormant, or we kill them. Okay, so by causing the bacteria to remain dormant, we just simply don't meet one or more of those three conditions of low oxygen, low acidity, and a temperature. So freezing, for instance, would stop the growth of botulism or stop it from becoming active. So the ways that we do this typically is with water bathing, what we call water bath canning or pressure canning. What we're doing with water bath canning is we're not killing the botulism. I hear this a lot, like high acid, is going to kill the botulism. Well, it's not botulism that you're killing, it's the bacteria that causes it, but, we won't split hairs on that, but you're not killing the bacteria, you're simply causing it to remain dormant in that high acid environment, and it's in a state in which it won't grow and it won't hurt you. Okay, so this is why on water bath recipes, we usually add vinegar, citric acid, lemon juice, okay, to make sure the acidity is high enough. And that is when you see someone talk about pH, a pH of 4.6 or below is what you want for water bath canning. And the pH goes down as the acidity goes up. And when the acidity goes down, the pH comes up. So they work, in opposite to each other. So a pH of 4.6 or below. And unless you have a pH meter to test it with, you're not going to know other than follow a tested recipe. The other way is to kill the bacteria, and we do that by subjecting them to the correct temperature for the correct amount of time. And we want that temperature to be 240 degrees for the time specified. And different foods will have different densities and heat penetration rates. So this pint of meat will have to stay at that temperature for 1 hour and 15 minutes. And these carrots will be less than that. I think these carrots are 40 minutes, but don't quote me on that. Look it up. I always look it up before I can to make sure. Okay. But I do enough meat that I know that's 1 hour and 15 for pints. And then if you put it in a quart jar, which is bigger, it will take longer for the heat to penetrate to the center of it. So this pint of meat will go to 1 hour and a half in a quart. And so with a quart of meat would go to 1 hour and a half. So I want to talk a little bit about pressure and boiling rates and altitude. And this is something that kind of didn't make sense to me at first. So when you're at 1,000 feet or below sea level, 1,000 feet above and below on sea level. So how sounds kind of weird. 1,000 feet above sea level or below that. So all the way down to sea level up to 1,000 feet above sea level, you're going to typically can at 10 pounds of pressure. That's going to be 240 degrees. When you get above that, that temperature of 10 pounds of pressure is lower. And you stop and you're like, this really got me. If I'm putting that weight on and I'm creating that pressure inside the canner, how does it care what the sea level is, right? What you have to understand is that water begins to boil at a lower and lower temperature as you go higher because the pressure outside of the canner is lower. So if you're higher and the pressure's lower outside the canner, even though there's 10 pounds there, it's 10 pounds to what's outside the canner. Pressure's lower outside the canner, so that 10 pounds of weight is going to allow that difference. That you're talking about the difference, it's 10 pounds of difference between inside the canner and outside. So when we get higher, we have to go like a 15-pound weight to get the same temperature inside the canner to kill it. So always look up your altitude and follow the guidelines as to how many pounds of pressure you're supposed to be running. And you can get your altitude just by like Googling your address and the word altitude on Google, and it'll come back with it. So I want to talk about some other things. I call them misconceptions, or the things that confused me at first. So you'll hear people say, if you want to make sure you don't get botulism, when you opened up some canned vegetables, you boil them for 10 minutes, and that'll kill any botulism that's in them. And you're thinking, okay, so I had to put these in a pressure canner and can them for 40 minutes at so many pounds of pressure at a 240 degree temperature in order to kill botulism. But if it happened to survive, I can kill it by boiling it for 10 minutes. And it's important to understand that the boiling process doesn't kill the botulism bacteria when you open that, if there was botulism growing in there. And botulism you won't see it. It doesn't make the water cloudy. It doesn't make it smell funny. It doesn't look funny. It won't necessarily pop the lid. It can be in there and look perfectly fine, which is one of the reasons that it's so dangerous. But when you're boiling for 10 minutes, you are destroying the botulism toxin and neutralizing it, and so that it won't kill you. Okay? So the boiling for 10 minutes doesn't kill the bacteria. The bacteria are harmless to you. It destroys the toxin that the bacteria make if they happen to be growing in there. So when you can, it's always a good idea to boil at a rolling boil for 10 minutes just to make sure. So here's another misconception that people seem to have, and I think this is an important one for SHTF because people will be trying all kinds of crazy stuff to preserve their food in a extended grid down situation. And it's my neighbor ate it last week, and he's still alive, so it must be okay, so I'm going to pop this open and eat it. It's important to realize that botulism poisoning can take a month, or it will take from 1 month to 2 months, from 4 weeks to 8 weeks for symptoms to develop. So it's slow acting, but then when it kicks in, it starts progressing rather rapidly. So your neighbor could have ate it 3 weeks ago and been fine, and you'll eat it, and you could still get botulism from that. He may not develop symptoms for another, week to a week and a month away. So botulism takes a while for symptoms to develop. And I'll talk a little bit just here briefly about the symptoms. The symptoms are actually close to what a lot of doctors would think was a stroke when they present. Trouble swallowing, paralysis of the face, trouble focusing, double vision, slurred speech. These are all initial symptoms of botulism poisoning, and it'll end up with you in the hospital on a respirator for months, completely paralyzed. It's important that if you do eat home canned goods and you experience those symptoms, that you and your family members know to tell the doctors that you eat home canned goods and there is a chance of botulism poisoning, um, and have them test for that, so they're not going down the wrong path, because there is botulism antitoxins that are developed by the Centers for Disease Control, and the sooner your hospital can get those for you and get them on board, the less long-term permanent problems you're going to have, like permanent partial paralysis. There are a lot of people who've had botulism who still to this day have trouble swallowing, have trouble walking, talking. Um, so the sooner they get that on board, the shorter your stay in the hospital is going to be, the better your symptoms, or quicker you're going to recover, and the better your long-term outlook will be. So just some thoughts there. So here's some kind of unseen traps, I think. Number one is you can't can everything you see people do on YouTube. I've seen people say, I'm going to microwave canned butter. I won't say the channel name because I really like his channel. He's a great guy. But that's a dangerous video. And I would just ask, if you're on YouTube and you have a channel and you're doing things that aren't necessarily approved or safe, if you want to do them and risk your life and the life of your family, fine. Please quit putting videos out there and encouraging others to try these things. I don't see it. I'm not going to post something like that on YouTube. I've also seen one. We're going to can a meatloaf in a jar. You can put some eggs in there and some crackers, whatever you want. There's so many things wrong with that. One is you can't can eggs; they're not approved. You can't can any type of grain products, bread, crackers, rice, barley. Okay, they're not approved. And barley, I've canned it before. It's not approved, but if you use it sparingly, it holds together well. You're not creating a density issue. You probably can it, but it's not something that they've tested, and it's not an approved ingredient. So there's a difference between unapproved and untested and unsafe. But things like meatloaf are clearly a density issue. They're clearly using unapproved ingredients. That's a real problem. And if you do that long enough, you're going to stop getting lucky, and you're probably going to get something like botulism. So if you're getting started canning, until you're experienced and you know and you've done a lot of reading, stay away from everybody on YouTube that just got a new pressure canner and they're doing videos on what they think they can. And there's even very experienced canners that are doing some of these things, but I still would shy away from those things if you're new and just getting started. Another thing is incorrect processing times. I'm going to put it in the fridge. So this is, I'm canning some meat, and emergency came up. I was a fourth of the way through my processing time, so I turned the sucker off. I got out there and took care of my emergency, came back, didn't have time to reprocess, so I'm just going to throw them in the fridge. And then you pop them open, and you know what? At a fourth to halfway through, they'll be cooked. They won't be raw. They'll look good. And you'll be like, I don't have time to reprocess them right now. I'm just going to use them in some beef and noodles. Okay? They've been in the fridge. They'll be fine. Now, what have you done? Most refrigerators are going to be a little bit above 40 degrees. You have an anaerobic environment because it's sealed. And you process long enough to create a vacuum. And you put it in the fridge with a temperature that's high enough for the botulism to grow. And it's been longer than 3 or 4 days. You've just created botulism. So anytime you have incorrect processing times, if you're not going to process right away, you're going to want to remove the lids and replace before you reprocess anyway. So pop those lids loose, get oxygen in that jar before you refrigerate. And, food density, we talked about that a little bit with that. If you're going to can things, like I like this sausage and lentil soup, it's not an approved recipe, but I make, it's not too dense, right? You can see how it moves and flows. But if you're creating something that's really, really, really dense, then you may not get proper heat penetration. So if you're making a recipe and it looks a little too thick, it probably is. Just add some water to it and thin it out. spread it out. Um, and modern tomatoes. Okay, so there's so many bad tomato canning things on YouTube. I can't even begin to count. Open kettle canning is dangerous. It's not approved. This is where you just get the jars good and hot and pour hot tomatoes in them and put a lid on them and watch them seal. It's a good way to kill yourself. One of the things you have to understand is that modern tomatoes, the hybrids we have now, are not as acidic as they used to be back in 1940. And so we typically have to add lemon juice or citric acid to tomatoes when we can them to bring that acidity high enough, unless we're boiling and condensing it down. Sometimes we don't have to when we're doing sauces, for instance. But follow approved methods and recipes. Green beans. I've seen quite a few people that are like, I'm going to make my green beans, I'm going to put a chunk of bacon in there. And they run it for the green bean processing time. You have to run it for the chunk of meat processing time, which is an hour and 15 minutes. Okay? Not the 40 minutes or whatever that green beans are. So I guess that's some of the things, some of the traps I will talk about. And just watch out for those things. And basically, if you follow approved methods and recipes, and the simplest and cheapest way to do that, and I'll put a link to it below the video, is to download the book that the USDA puts out in a PDF format that you can then print out or just keep on your electronic device. Has all the canning methods, it has some recipes, it has all the processing times, has an introduction to canning book that's going to explain a lot of this botulism and temperature stuff to you. Read through that, be familiar with it. It's a great book. You can do a lot of canning with that. And there's other books that are not free, like the Ball Blue book, the Ball Book of Home Preserving. Those are all good books. One of my favorite books is a book called Putting Food By. Excellent book. It's been out since the 70s, and they've revised it with updated methods along the way. I think that's an excellent resource. There's a lot of very good books on canning and that use tested approved recipes, and there's a lot of very bad recipes out on the internet that are using inappropriate times and processing methods. If you're going to get into canning, take the time, do it right, don't take shortcuts, or don't do it at all. I've never gotten sick off of anything I've canned. I've gotten sick off of commercial products from my grocery store before, but never anything I've processed and canned myself. But there's the ability, if you are not doing it right, you're not reading, you're not paying attention, you're doing things incorrect, that people will get sick. Every time you hear about a botulism outbreak, there was one at a church here in Ohio, I believe, a couple years back with potato salad made from water bath potatoes. Potatoes are a low acid food. They must be pressure canned. And people died, and dozens of people got really sick at a church potluck from water bath potato salad. I typically, unless I've seen somebody canning and I know that they have the same beliefs as me, I don't eat their canned goods. Unless I know what's going on. If it's pickles or something that's obviously high acid, I may. But if somebody comes over with some canned green beans and I don't know that they were pressure canned for the right amount of time, I'll keep the jar. But the green beans are probably going to go in the trash. Just because I don't know what they're doing. And there's so many people that are still doing it the way Grandma did it in 1940. And those methods weren't safe. We've learned a lot since 1940. And bacteria and microorganisms have changed and become more resistant because of the overuse of antibiotics and such. So the microorganisms are not the same. They evolve and change over time as well. We now know about 7 different strains of the botulism the bacteria that cause botulism. We used to know about 1 in 1940. And those other strains still produce the same toxins, but they require much higher temperatures or longer times to kill. So we didn't know about them to test for them back then. So things are always changing and evolving, and science is more. And the USDA, for the parts of it I may disagree with, Um, when they're doing all this lab work and testing of canned foods, that's something that we pay taxes for, that we get to use as taxpayers free of charge, is that information. And I don't believe that the USDA wants to kill all the home canners, or that the USDA that is some big conspiracy that they're telling you not to can this. They're doing it because it's not safe, and they want to make sure that everybody that cans is safe. That's their job. That's what they do. There's a lot of other good resources through your extension offices in your counties. There's all kinds of information out there from credible resources. So follow tested and approved recipes, and you're going to be 100% fine. When people get sick from from eating home canned goods, it's because somebody did it grandma's way, or they just didn't know what they were doing. Okay, that's all I got. I hope some of that wasn't too repetitive. It's a rather long video, but I think it's an important topic to dive into. And what we're going to start to talk about next is how you can get started doing some water bath canning without spending a whole lot of money. This will get you into the canning process and learning some things and doing some things. And it allows you to see if the time that you invest in canning is going to be worth it to you. It's a time-consuming process, but it saves you a lot of time on the other end as well. Or if you want to keep going to McDonald's for McDoubles. Okay, that's a lot faster. So that way you're not investing a bunch of money in equipment and pressure canners before you've given it a shot, and you can grow from there. This is Tom, your frugal prepper. I'll talk to everybody later.